Hi, welcome back to my 5-part workplace violence prevention video series, which I've created to help businesses, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies to protect your staff, your organization's reputation, and your bottom line by preventing workplace violence. In today's video, the 5th and final in our series, we'll look at what your staff can do to protect themselves if situations escalate into a violent attack through taking away an attacker's advantage in a process called changing the dynamics of an attack. And we'll look at how to quickly stop an attack with some basic self-defense and primarily the mindset that we need to have to make that work. Workplace violence doesn't have to happen to your organization. In fact, workplace violence is fully preventable, which means that your employees do not have to be among the 2 million Americans each year who report being a victim of workplace violence. And your organization does not need to suffer through the higher turnover and absenteeism rates, lower employee morale, lower productivity, damage to public reputation, and lost sales and profit that are experienced by businesses that have episodes of workplace violence. In the first video in this series, we looked at the different sources of workplace violence, including coworkers and business invitees, like clients, patients, vendors, and also members of the public. We looked at who's at risk from workplace violence, how it can strike at your place of business as well as out in the community, and why women, medical professionals, legal professionals, and even government employees are at a high risk for workplace violence. And finally, we covered the different approaches to preventing workplace violence, what does and what does not work. In the second video, we covered how to prevent employee and coworker related workplace violence from developing by implementing an effective internal investigation and complaint system that inspires confidence in your staff. In the third video, we covered how simple changes to the interior and exterior layout of your workplace and how adopting some simple internal communication approaches can help prevent workplace violence at your premises by invitees, including patients, clients, customers, vendors, and others. In the fourth video, we covered how incorporating situational awareness and de-escalation techniques can help your staff prevent an attack while working out in the community, as well as while working on premises, by avoiding a threat to their safety and by preventing a tense situation from ratcheting up into an attack. Hey, I'm Mike Corwin. I spent over 30 years conducting civil and criminal litigation investigations in Los Angeles, California, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. I conducted numerous investigations of workplace violence, sadly including several homicides. For over 10 years, I've taught my approach to workplace violence prevention to hundreds of people working for private businesses, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies, including to the staff of a United States senator. And if you'd like to learn more about workplace violence prevention and to get started keeping your business and staff safer, check out my free workplace violence prevention checklist. It's chock full of actionable items you can begin doing today. There's a link to it in the description below. And if you've missed any of the prior videos from this series, you can find a link to those in the description below as well. Now let's dig in. So we have talked about ways of avoiding, de-escalating, and preventing workplace violence. But what does your staff do if something unfurls, if some kind of violent attack, whether out in the field or at the office or at the workplace happens? What do they do? Well, there's essentially two components involved in dealing with that type of an attack. The first is what I call changing the dynamics of an attack. And what you're doing by that is you're taking away an attacker's initial advantage so that you have a chance to defend yourself and to get out of there safely. If you think about it, when an attack occurs, the attacker knows they're about to launch into an attack, but you don't. So they have that advantage that comes from what's in essence a sneak attack. So we want to be able to offset that. Now, what changing of the dynamics does is it takes the attacker out of the attacker's initial mindset of attack and actually forces them onto the defense for even just a moment or two. So think about it from this perspective. Let's say there's a gunman that's loose in the workplace and they come into an office. If you are hiding on the door side of the jamb, basically behind the door, when he comes into the office, he can literally pin you behind the door and shoot through the door or whatever he needs to do, but you are trapped. On the other hand, if you're hiding on the latch side of the door, the very first thing that comes through that room is actually the firearm. That gives you a chance to grab it. You actually are now in control because you are controlling the weapon. So think about that in terms of changing the dynamics. Now that's a pretty drastic example. Can be much smaller than that. A simple distraction technique is changing the dynamics of an attack. So for example, somebody throws a punch at you and you block that punch and then you do a counter strike, even if it's not necessarily an effective counter strike. The attacker has to respond, one, to his missed strike, and two, to your effort to strike back. That actually changes his whole focus. In causing that reorientation, you are creating opportunity for yourself either to exit, ideally if we can, that's what we want to do, or to then engage. What we're looking for is an action that creates a change momentarily in the attacker's mindset that creates opportunity for you. Let's say your staff member is out working in a client's home and he's in the kitchen with your client, and all of a sudden your client pulls out a knife from a drawer. Being able to move, and let's say move to the other side of the table before the client can approach and wants to attack, he's got to choose going left or he's got to choose going right. And either way that he moves, your staff member has the opportunity to move in the different direction and hopefully head towards an exit. The other thing that I want to talk about with you and what your staff needs to know, and again, this also needs to be both for the workplace and for your staff that works out in the field, is to understand self-defense, what works, what doesn't work, and having the right mindset to understand what you need to do for self-defense. So the first thing I want to talk about with self-defense is your goal is not to knock out the attacker. It's not to incapacitate the attacker. Your goal is to survive the onslaught of the attack and to be able to create an opportunity to exit the situation safely. Now, doesn't that sound a whole lot less intimidating? Number two, a mindset that is often overlooked when it comes to self-defense is that many systems that teach self-defense focus on targets. They're what are called target-centered focus. For example, you got to hit the guy in the groin. You got to hit him in the throat. You got to hit him in a soft spot. And yes, all of those are great targets, but let's be realistic about what happens in an attack. It's chaotic, it's stressful, it's threatening, all kinds of stuff is going on, and the ability for you to go, okay, I need to hit him in the groin, I need to hit him in the eyes, any of those things goes out the window under that level of stress. And in addition to that, those targets just aren't necessarily available, right? Guys have been getting hit in the groin since they were kids. It's a game they play with each other. They know how to protect their groin. If their hands are up, you're not getting to their eyes, their jaw, anything like that. It's just not going to happen. So here's what I want you to think about in terms of self-defense and mindset. The best place to attack is the one that's available. So if their foot is available and you can stomp on it, you stomp on it. If their knee's available and you can kick it, you kick it. If their throat is available, then you go to their throat. But remember that the main thing here is to go for what's available. The next mindset thing that I want to talk about, and this is something that I have taught for so many years, when you engage on the ground with an attacker, you've already lost. And here's why. The ground acts like a second attacker. And yes, I know the jiu-jitsu people always talk about how most fights end up on the ground. And you know what? They're talking about fights. An attack is different. Most attacks are over in 7 seconds or less. They're done because the attacker overwhelms. So they call it submission grappling, and it's sport. And it's a wonderful sport, but you don't want to stay on the ground. The sooner you get off the ground, if you end up on the ground, the better you are able to protect yourself. I want you to visualize that. If you are face up, laying on the ground, and your attacker is over you, you're immobilized not just by the attacker, but by the ground. And by the way, the same thing goes to backing up into any type of obstacle, whether it's a car in a parking lot, a wall in an office. I don't teach people to back up because sooner or later you are going to back up into something and then you're pinned. You are effectively again dealing with a second attacker who's controlling your movement, and that person now has you pinned in. In terms of what does and does not work for self-defense techniques, the techniques that I teach happen to have been taught by the Allied forces in World War II to the women and men that they secretly placed behind Nazi lines to work with the local resistance. They had to learn very effective self-defense techniques in a very short period of time that could be used no matter what size, strength they were, what kind of condition they were in, because they couldn't carry their weapons, right? Their weapons would give them away as members of the Allied forces. They had to cache their weapons and rely upon themselves. And with all of the many things that they had to learn in order to be effective at working with the resistance behind enemy lines, teaching themselves to defend themselves and protect themselves was kind of late in the process. So they didn't get hours and hours and hours of practice. Now, I rely very heavily on what I call being in close to the attacker. When it comes to most attacks, and that includes armed attacks and unarmed attacks, being at a 2 or 3 foot range is definitely not really beneficial, or even a little further back than that. And particularly think about this with a firearm. A bullet travels at what, 1,500 feet a second? Distance is no friend, right? For a firearm, you've got to control the barrel, which means you've got to be in place where you can grab the barrel. For a knife to control the barrel, you have to control the juncture of the hand and the wrist, because that's what controls the knife. And if you aren't in close, you're not going to be able to do that. And the same for a simple punch, right? A punch has maximum power at full extension. The closer in you are, the harder it is for an attacker to engage with a full-powered attack to you. Elbows and knees are the ideal weapons to use for yourself when you are in close, and they can go to a variety of targets. A knee is a great thing to strike to the leg, not just the groin, which is what everybody thinks of, but as I mentioned, most guys know how to position themselves to not get struck in the groin. But a knee into the leg can give them a dead leg, which means you don't even have to run away, you can walk away. Same with an elbow. And an elbow is also great for when somebody tries to grab you from behind, because an elbow can be struck in straight behind you. Now, these are just some simple techniques that I want you to understand. And by the way, I don't teach punches. I teach palm strikes and hammer fists. Palm strikes use the thick part of the palm of your hand, the heel, and they're just simple, quick strikes. Hammer fist uses the fleshy part of the bottom of your hand down here, and is ideal because you can swing just like you're hitting a hammer from in close without risk to hurting yourself. One of the other mindset changes that we need to understand about defending yourself is that one and done strikes don't work. You have to keep striking, whether it's with your elbows, your knees, your hammer fist, your palm strike. You keep striking until you create the opportunity to get out of there safely. And by the way, when I work with businesses, their staff gets unlimited access to all of my training videos so that they can take those and practice and watch until they master those techniques. I hope you found this series on workplace violence prevention helpful. And if you'd like to learn more about workplace violence prevention and to get started keeping your business and staff safer today, check out my free workplace violence prevention checklist. You can find a link to it in the description below. And if you missed any of the prior videos, you'll also find a link to those in the description below as well. Thanks.